Good evening, everyone. You're watching Bharat Voice. I'm Ritika Acharya, and today on Bharat Voice, we are discussing the current conflict and the current crisis that's going on between Russia and Ukraine. And, while there's a lot of war mongering about what's going on and Russia could soon invade into Ukraine, and Russia has already positioned its troops at the border of Ukraine, there's also a lot of discussion, and there's also an effort on the part of Europe to also not try and escalate the situation into a war-like situation. But the fact is that for people like us sitting in India, we like to get a clear picture because amidst all these developments and amidst all these confusion, we'd like to hear fresh perspective and we'd like to clear the air, hear from the Russian side and try to understand exactly what is going on and what are the intentions of President Putin. To discuss this with us, we have with us Maxim Suchkov. He's a professor at the MGIMU, and he's also associated with the think tank Russian International Affairs Council. Maxim, welcome to Bharat Voice.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure to be with you.
Maxim, this is the second time, we've got you with us. Last time we discussed about Afghanistan, and this time it's a very important topic because we're talking about your own country. We want to hear firsthand from you as to what exactly is going on. And, everyone's saying that we are headed towards war, and some people are trying to do this warmongering situation. US is reiterating that, okay, this could escalate anytime, and therefore we need to be careful. The NATO has gotten involved now. And Ukraine, although Russia and Ukraine did have like ceasefire discussions about a day back, but what exactly are we expecting?
Well, I think we have to, I have to begin with the premise saying that I don't necessarily agree with the very framing of the current situation as the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, because the smoldering tensions and the war in the east of Ukraine with the alleged support of Russia of the separatist forces in Donbass have been raging on since 2014.
Right.
But the current tensions are, sparked, if we may say so, a little earlier last year, when the Moscow have observed the rising tensions in the east of Ukraine, with the Ukrainian government forces frequently attacking Donbass positions, and the Russian military observed more military hardware and military trainers and private military contractors from Western countries were going to Ukraine to support this offensive. It usually the official kind of beginning of the crisis is President Putin's address to the foreign ministry in December. In early December last year, where he said that Russia has to put forward a package of proposals for Russia's security guarantees, because, as he explained back then, Russia could not tolerate the situation where the American military buildup and the NATO buildup has been going on around the Russian border. So from that point on, in a few weeks, the Russian Foreign Ministry has put forward two packages of security guarantees of Russia, as was seen from Moscow, of course, to the United States, and the other one to NATO, and the round, which in a way took Western governments by surprise, because these packages were so comprehensive. So they included pretty much every single grievance Russia has ever accumulated since the breakup of the Soviet Union. But in fact, there were only three major categories. One, Russia demanded that all the military hardware of NATO should be rolled back to the positions of 1997, when there were no NATO expansion eastward. Second, that Georgia and most importantly Ukraine are never become members of NATO. And the third one, that no military offensive weapons are deployed near the Russian borders. So around these three major sets of discussions, further contacts between Russian and American and NATO diplomats and military people have evolved ever since.
So, but, Maxim, what happens is that in this sort of situation, everyone will talk about the fact that, Vladimir Putin, President Putin, is trying to reassert its authority and dominance and try to, especially over the states which were earlier part of Soviet Union. And then because that happens, therefore, America obviously would talk about the fact that immediately could be a war and we all need to be careful. And then Ukraine also will come out and make statements that, no matter what happens, and even if there are ceasefire discussions, and even if there are discussions which are initiated by France, which recently happened in Paris, we still cannot go ahead and trust Vladimir Putin. What do you have to say about that?
Sure. Well, that's. Well, I think we're dealing with the crisis on several levels simultaneously here, and kind of a more legal and political levels. There are two really divergent sets of visions. One is that NATO and the U.S. government say Russia cannot dictate what members should join NATO and not, especially if it's sovereign countries. It's their sovereign choice. The Russian counterposition to that is the same declarations, especially the Istanbul Declaration of 1999 and the Astana Declaration of 2010, the declarations that certified the rights for sovereign nations to choose their alliances. They also certified the position of the concept of the so-called undivided security in Europe, which basically the premise of it says that you cannot maintain your security at the expense of security of others. So basically, Russia's position is that you can't really drag a country into a military alliance, or the country itself cannot go to a military alliance without thinking of the consequences that it may create for others, Russia in that case. So basically, this is one kind of set of arguments. Another set of arguments is that ever since the, yes, sure. Oh no, I was going to say
go ahead.
Another set of arguments says that since the events in Ukraine in 2014 that Russia sees as a coup when the legitimately elected President Yanukovych was toppled in a coup supported by the United States, Ukraine has become a protectorate virtual of the United States and Great Britain to some degree and other NATO members. And its leadership has not been free in its own choices to select alliances. And the third thing is Ukraine has traditionally been kind of a mixture of, more pro-Western and more pro-Russian sentiments, and which, drag country to different directions. That created kind of a crisis on this political level. The invasion that everyone is talking about, especially in the Western media these days, stems from the point of the Russian military deployments on the Ukrainian border. I tend to believe that the deployments are not there for invasion because it would be too blunt. And there isn't even a joke in the Russian discourse that says, the alleged the invasion is like Italian robbing the bank. There's this anecdote that Mario one day decided to rob the bank and told the whole city that he was going to do it. And the whole city, bids farewell and says, okay, Mario, go do it. But the bank itself is not concerned, and it never takes place because it looks there are too many obvious things. But most importantly, even jokes aside, most importantly, there are no clear political goals that Russia could achieve through military invasion that it should achieve in Ukraine. So my take is that the military buildup is about deterring Ukrainian forces from further attacking the Donbass, and B, to compel the West to these security talks that are now being in place.
Okay, so that's a solid statement you've made there, that Russia actually does not have any political gains out of it, and you said that you explained it in the context of the joke that okay, the bank itself is not bothered. So are you in a way trying to say that because Ukraine did come out and make statements, and the president came out and make statements that we actually ready to have ceasefire talks, and all this does not look like a situation as to it's going into a war sort of a situation. So it's not happening at the moment. Can we clearly say that?
Well, I think it's been very important dynamics over the few days as far as Ukraine and Donbass conflict are concerned. There were talks resumed in Paris that haven't taken place in a long while. There was this positive statements made by all parties. And most importantly, in a few days, we see Ukrainian officials saying they're not actually expecting the imminent invasion that the State Department is talking about. And there was even this story that said the Ukrainian officials are actually bewildered by the sudden pullout of diplomatic corps of the United States. And they're asking the American partners, well, why are you, pushing the diplomatic staff to leave when there is no
mm,
actually imminent threat. So I think
mm,
there is a little bit of this interesting spats and moments going on, again, like I said, on different levels, which
mm.
create a lot of this feeling of precariousness and
Right.
concern.
Maxim, could you talk us through the situation in Russia at the moment, and what do you think is going on? What do the people of Russia feel, that could it turn into a precarious situation, or they are actually not really that bothered by the media reports that are going on at the moment? That's number one. And number two, of course, we really need to question here as to what are the long-term results of this going to be. Is there going to be an end result? Is there going to be a solid diplomatic solution so that there is no warlike situation, there are no conflicts in the future, and there are no issues in the future as well. And there's absolutely no one interfering in the affairs of Russia or Ukraine for the matter.
Well, a few things as far as Russian domestics are concerned. First, the recent Levada poll in Levada tends to be a more kind of pro-Western. I wouldn't say anti-Putin, but more kind of pro-Western leaning polling organization. So that's to say it's not kind of pro-government survey. They found that about 50% of the surveyed believe it's the United States and the West to blame for the crisis, and 13% believe it's Ukraine to be blamed for the start of the crisis. Only 4 to 5% believe it's Russia to be blamed for the crisis. So I would say the popular support so far has been on President Putin's side. And most importantly, Putin in this situation does not act as a politician, but he acts more as a kind of historical personality in his own view, because he doesn't have to think about being reelected. He doesn't have to think about other political stuff that Western leaders have to think about. So that in this current crisis gives him a little more leverage above Western leaders, including above President Biden, who has to care about midterm elections and the re-election of Democratic candidate in 2024. The long-term effects of that, I think that's why actually I started with it. I don't think the essence of it is a crisis between Russia and Ukraine. It's a crisis between Russia and the West in general, because it's Russia's major diplomatic offensive in 30 years to rethink the terms of Euro-Atlantic security and the terms for its own security. One big kind of reorganizing of principles was in Yalta, when the winning powers were discussing the fate of Europe after World War II. The second one came in late 1980s, 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and after collapse of the bipolar system, which ended in conditions unfavorable to Russia. And that's something that President Putin has fought against throughout 20 years of his presidency. Now he perhaps believes that there is this moment where Russia can actually put on the table some of its grievances and demand serious concessions and serious rethinking of that. So I think the shot is pretty big as far as the Russian thinking is concerned. We'll see what comes of it.
Okay. Maxim, could you talk to us about a little bit about Russia's relations with Europe at the moment? Because the thing is that a lot of people are also saying that Europe is taking a very so-called balance and a very diplomatic sort of a stance here, because the fact is that their energy and gas needs are being fulfilled by Russia, and so they don't want to, go ahead and cross the line. So they're actually trying to play the balancing game here. And do you think that Russia really needs the help of Europe here to solve the matters with Ukraine at the moment, or you can do it on your own?
Well, of course, Russia's relations with Europe are key. Europe remains the major importer of Russian energy resources. This is a major energy export market for Russia, and on many other levels, relations with Europe are incredibly important. But there are a number of problems. One problem is that over the past few decades, I would say, Europe has very much outsourced not only its security to the Americans, but also the decision-making on most fateful decisions for Europe to the United States, basically allowing the Americans to make decisions for them. And on a number of occasions, they opted to be more a payer rather than a player. And we see that trend in Ukraine as well, where the Europeans are willing to pay or allocate financial support or military support to the Ukrainians, but not to be involved in any major decision making. The second problem, I think, is that Europe is very strict. Well, I wouldn't say strictly divided, but is very different in its approaches to Russia. Obviously, there are countries in East Europe, the Poles, the Baltic states,
Yeah.
that have their own historical grievances with Russia, and they have hijacked, in Moscow's view, a lot of the decision making on the European front towards Russia. That doesn't necessarily make a lot of Western Europeans happy, like the French and the Germans, the Italians, who would rather perhaps think, differently in terms of the quote-unquote continental diplomacy vis-a-vis Russia, but they have to follow this in this streamline of more kind of hostile and policies towards Russia to show unity within, including within NATO. That, I think, limits Europe's own leverage towards Russia. I think there is no illusion in Moscow at this moment that even if the conflict continues to escalate, or if, God forbid, it spills over to military domain, the Europeans will side with Americans and will slip sanctions on Russia, which will very much be a shooting in their own foot because of the potential implications in terms of energy supplies and other things. But I hope Europe indeed can play a more constructive role here. And Russia should be also careful in not alienating major European stakeholders in that crisis entirely.
Okay, Maxim, can you talk to us also a little bit about the recent meeting that took place between Lavrov and Blinken, and what exactly came out of that meeting? What are the outcomes of those meetings?
Well, I think the major outcome from that meeting actually came after the meeting, with Americans proposing their own counter proposals to Moscow in response to Russia's security guarantees. The immediate fallout from those proposals has been rather critical. Both the lawmakers and the foreign ministry and the Kremlin said that the major issues that Russia raised have not been addressed. The issue of Ukraine in NATO has not been addressed. The issue of NATO, kind of political aspects of relations with Russia have not been addressed, but there were interesting proposals in terms of missiles deployments, these kind of things that are very important, and they actually also have not been discussed in the last few years. So I wouldn't say these contacts are entirely, fruitless. I would also pay attention that these contacts between Americans and Russians began with the level of deputy foreign ministers, and now they're gradually making their way to the level of foreign ministers, and there's a talk of another phone call or a summit between Putin and Biden. So I think it to me is an optimistic sign that says that the both parties are serious and interested in taking this thing seriously. But so far, we haven't heard what the single most important man in this whole situation is thinking about this, and that's President Putin, who has kept silent on these issues for a long time and hasn't made any statements about the proposals that he received. And the Kremlin says he needs time to study them. So we'll see.
Okay, so but Maxim, because since we're talking about US, there's always an air of, and there's always like a conflict of the superpower conflict. And do you think that in a way there's always going to be a way that Russia's image is going to be maligned, and indirectly or directly Russia is being trying to provoke into this situation? And do you think that the focus suddenly has shifted from Afghanistan and from the Indo-Pacific region suddenly has shifted to Europe and Russia?
Well, the image of and the issue of perceptions and images, I think, is in the domain of this kind of information warfare that's been going on between Russia and the United States, and obviously because the U.S. has a more global media presence, it's hard to fight off the image of an angry bear that is doing something bad in its neighborhood. But it's important to know that Russia is doing it in its own neighborhood and doesn't go to the mess stuff in Latin America or in America's backyard. Most importantly, however, I would say that obviously U.S.-Russia relations are not as important and are not as central to international relations as
Hmm.
the way the Soviet-U.S. relations were during the Cold War. And Russia is,
Hmm.
of course, a match for America in many domains, except in the strategic stability domain,
Hmm.
where Russia is still the single power that presents an existential challenge to the United States. And
Hmm.
that is a very important element to understanding this situation, because the only issue that Americans have been interested and seriously interested in talking about with Moscow was strategic stability and nuclear arms control. And now Russia is making it clear that no further progress is possible on these issues until Russia's security guarantees are discussed and taken seriously. As far as the Indo-Pacific region is concerned, that's, I think, a
Hmm.
second important element to take into consideration here, because what Russia is basically proposing for the United States is to discuss in a very serious manner the fate of the European security and the stakes that Russia may have in that system, knowing that the United States no longer thinks of Europe as its primary theater, and knowing as it thinks about China as its major challenge, and knowing that U.S. would like to reorient its resources and political will towards
Hmm.
Indo-Pacific, and kind of forgets about Europe, or know that everything is calm on the European theater, so it can focus on China and the Indo-Pacific.
Hmm.
So basically, I think if there was more realism in American foreign policy these days, they would think and listen to these calls, and view these calls in this same matter, thinking of it not as a challenge that Russia is presenting, but as an opportunity to design a more favorable to everyone European security architecture, where Russia could have a stake and feel secure, and then focus on things that are to them. But we know American policy is a little more complicated than that.
Hmm. Okay, so then since we're talking about US and US's foreign policies as well, do you think that since US since some time back was taking a very anti-China sort of a stance, we often like to hear about the Russia stance as well. What does Russia think about China as an emerging, let's say, superpower in the world?
Well, obviously, the moment in the current Russian-Chinese relation is that both countries talk about, partnership, strategic partnership, but are very careful about, concrete military commitments. So it's kind of a partnership without a treaty-based military alliance. I would say that the philosophy that underpins contemporary Russian-Chinese relations is that
Hmm.
could be perhaps phrased in this not always together, but never against one another.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
So what it
Hmm.
obviously makes sense for Russia to have non-conflictual relations with China, and look at
Hmm.
China as a country that on a number of issues can be alternative source of growth, now that relations with the West are so complicated,
Hmm.
that many Russian companies are sanctioned, and so on and so forth.
Hmm.
And there is this vision channeled from the top leadership of
Hmm.
Russia. But there is also, I would say, a prudent vision towards getting too close to China, that China would like to play its own kind of global game, where Russia may not always find its place, or not be 100% partner on these issues. But what I think brings both countries together in this particular crisis is that both would like to see a greater de-Americanization of the American
Hmm.
system, and a lesser role for the United States in its current form, in the form that U.S. would like to make alliances and stuff.
Hmm.
But again, if we're talking about a number of international issues, a number of issues within BRICS, Russia is aware of all the kind of fine and very nuanced differences with China, and would like to keep balance when it comes to China's own relations with important partners such as India for Russia.
All right, fair enough. And since you mentioned India, I have to ask you then, what sort of a stance would you expect India to particularly take in this situation? And though India always does play a very balancing act, India does take a diplomatic stance, but what would you expect from India in this current situation? And if you'd like to harp on and emphasize a little bit on Russia-India relations at the moment, because Vladimir Putin, we did see him, just a few months back, we saw him visiting India just for a few hours to meet our Prime Minister Modi.
Yeah, well, I think the sober-minded expectation in Moscow is that no parties outside Europe are supposed to jump on anyone's wagon, either for America or for Russia. And it's not their fight, it's not India's fight in that respect. So Russia does not expect India or even China in that sense to take a more assertive position against Americans in favor of Russians or vice versa. But I think what's happening in the European theater is very important for the rest of the world, including for the Indo-Pacific, because it is, the United States has tried to transform the Europe after the World War II. And now, because the Soviet Union was a major threat then, and now it's thinking in similar terms, in Russia's view, of course, about the Indo-Pacific, because the United States is a young country, relatively young country, has the only experience of great power rivalry for America was the Cold War with the Soviet Union. So a lot of the policy patterns that Americans are adopting in its confrontation with China are actually adopted from that era. So I think that's important to see how that plays out, including for many countries in the Indo-Pacific, including for India. I think the good sign in that, and that's actually one important thing, that the technological platforms and technology would perhaps be one area that would very much define the fate of the US-China rivalry in the 21st century. But there are countries that would not like to see itself, placed in one basket, either for US or for China. So I think it's important for Russia to study India's own non-alignment movement during the Cold War and apply it to the technological domain, kind of to become, if not a leader, but a member of the digital non-alignment movement as far as US-China rivalry is concerned. So in that respect, I think Russia can be helpful to India in terms of building its security military industrial complex and its own things. I'm pretty optimistic on this S-400 deal that's recently been in place. But there is a tremendous agenda for both countries to expand, and I think that it's a pity and a great shame this has not been explored in greater depth.
All right, fair enough. Maxim, I have my last question about President Putin, and I just want to understand that, do you think that this current situation could, in a way, sort of hamper President Putin's plan of building a Eurasian economic union, something that he often, talks about?
Yes and no. Well, obviously, we have to say that many countries inside the Eurasian Union would also, as similar in the case of, like I mentioned, India, here many countries would not like to take sides either for Russia or for Ukraine, because many have, cultural, economic, and political ties to both countries, because they all were once part of one big nation. What's been going on on the border with Ukraine and in Ukraine has come as a big pity and a big pain for the rest of the post-Soviet space. On a more optimistic note, I think over the past couple of, especially in the last few months, Russia emerged as the only sovereignty provider for the post-Soviet space, given the crisis in Kazakhstan, given the events in Afghanistan. Basically, in the course of 6 months, Russia has dealt with 2 crises that stem from Central Asia, after the withdrawal of American forces in Afghanistan, and then later during this attempted coup, whatever it was, in Kazakhstan. And, it actually re-energized the CSTO as the only military organization that cares about its members, which in the past received a lot of criticism, including fair criticism. So I think in a few months, Russia has actually boosted its image in Eurasia, but we'll see if it's able to transform its political capital into some concrete economic gains.
All right, Maxim, you answered all pertinent questions. We asked you a couple of things about, what's happening in Russia at the moment and what is the next step going to be. But what we really are waiting for is President Putin's word on it, because he hasn't spoken yet. Just last few words from you as to what do you expect when he makes a statement? What possibly could he say?
Well, I expect there is no war. I think this is a major concern for everyone. From my observation, people in Russia are less concerned about these prospects because, like I said, people are not entirely convinced of what exactly the war would be about. So I think there is no risk of an intended war, especially on the Russian side. But in precarious situations like this, there are always risks of unintended war, because even in Ukraine, there are a lot of now that received a lot of military hardware from the West. There are people who would like to derail these talks between Russia and the West and Russia and Ukraine. So that would quickly escalate into a crisis. So I hope we can avoid that scenario, because if that takes place, then a chain of events would be, spiraling, and sanctions, and that would mess the markets, development, economies all over the place, and all that stuff. And it's COVID, still precarious COVID situation. That would be a terrible outcome for Russia and for the rest of the world as well.
All right, Maxim, on that note, thank you so much for answering all the questions. And like you said, let's really hope that it does not snowball into something really big. And, Russia and Ukraine are able to solve this matter. There is some quick end result. And we really hope that there's peace in the world.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maxim. And thank you so much for joining with us and answering all the questions on Bharat Voice.
Thank you so much. Always a pleasure with you.
Thank you.
All right.
Just a second, Maxim. It's just switching off.
Sure.
Takes a few seconds.